welcome to Out of the Box Radio with me, your host, Christine Blosdale. Out of the Box Radio is a weekly podcast of audible ear candy dedicated to bringing a fresh perspective on this thing that we call life. And each and every week, we're going to be diving into the topics that matter most with lively conversations on issues such as health, wellness, and transformational healing, all with the goal of creating a better world and becoming a happier human being. I will be your tour guide for this epic adventure, and each and every week we're going to be embarking on a journey with the ultimate goal being transformation to our highest potential. And now, let's get out of the box. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Out of the Box with Christine. I am your host, Christine Blosdale, and I am really happy that you tuned in today. We have an exciting program for you. My guest today is Donald Jeffries, and Donald started out investigating the JFK assassination as a teenager, and he was a volunteer with Mark Lane's Citizens Committee of Inquiry in the mid-1970s. Since then, his life has just taken a whole new direction. And not only has he been following up on the JFK assassination, but also that of John F. Kennedy Jr. And we're going to be talking about that because it's the 20-year anniversary of the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. And not much has been talked about. We're going to talk about that in the show, but we're also going to talk about some other things that have happened in history that Donald and myself have question marks around. So I just want to welcome to the program. We got a lot to cover, Donald. I want to welcome Donald Jeffries to Out of the Box with Christine.
Well, thanks for having me, Christine.
Well, I had just tapped in there in the beginning about the work that you've done investigating the JFK assassination, John F. Kennedy, our president. And if you don't mind, let's go back to that time in your life in the mid-70s, or maybe even earlier, when this whole thing happened. Did you know immediately that something was off about his assassination, or was that several years later?
Well, I was 7 when he was assassinated, but yeah, I pretty much perceived see things a little clearer than the mainstream media did at the time. They weren't questioning it, but yeah, even as a 7-year-old, I was from a Catholic family, and we were all proud. And I kind of experienced that pride from my large family that, took to Kennedy as this is something personal with him. He was the first Catholic president, so they were even more distraught, I guess, than maybe non-Catholic families were after he was killed. So, my first memories is watching that saturation coverage on television as a little kid, and the funeral and all that. I mean, it had a huge impact on me. And then Oswald getting shot, and instantly the doubts that came up everyone around me. And so I certainly never believed Oswald did it. I thought, I figured, well, he was silenced for some reason, but I was only 7, so I had about the sophistication level of an average mainstream journalist at 7. I couldn't figure it out any better now. But once I got to be a teenager and became politically aware after Watergate. I mean, I started out as a very left-wing Democrat that kept going left or far left, radical Democrat, and so, later on I became an independent when my eyes were opened a little bit to the left-right paradigm. But I started out that way, and of course I loved Kennedy. I started reading the books that had already been out. I mean, I was too young to read Rust and Judgment and all that when they first came out, but I started reading the books that came out in the early to mid-70s when, right before the House Select Committee on Assassinations was able to reopen it and do a pretty terrible job to disillusion us, but they did conclude at the last minute that it was probably the result of a conspiracy. Most people tend to forget that, but my group that I was with, Mark Lane's group, we lobbied Congress and tried to talk to the media, and it's my first, experience. Realized because I wanted to be a journalist, I wanted to be like Woodward and Bernstein, and I didn't understand that the media didn't operate the way it doesn't normally operate the way it did during Watergate. They normally do no investigating. And once I realized they weren't interested in who killed JFK or RFK or MLK, I said, wow, that really opened my eyes. And so I kind of began to drift towards political extremism, and the rest is history, where I pretty much question everything. And that would later, of course, include the death of his son, JFK Jr., whose career I kind of followed. But I had no idea until I investigated, and after he died, that he actually, behind the scenes, had a quest to find out who killed his father. And I don't think anybody knew that, and I certainly didn't know it until I talked to a couple people in his inner circle that requested to remain anonymous, very strongly requested to remain anonymous. And what's interesting about that is you realize how the lies that you see in the mainstream media. Recently, Fox News last month, which was the 20th anniversary in July of 1999 is when he died, ran an article from a so-called close friend of his. And it was headlined, close pal of JFK Jr.'s said he couldn't understand why people were interested in his father's assassination, and it was the one subject that you didn't discuss. Now I know personally from talking to people that knew him that that's just 180 degrees, opposite of the truth. And this close pal just happens to be the resident historian at the History Channel, which suits him well. So, and with that attitude and that ability to lie and completely distort the truth, whether he knew Kennedy or not, I don't know. But he certainly is lying about that. And so that's the kind of stuff that when you kind of know things a little bit personally, when you watch those stories appear, and it's very frustrating because you can't do anything about it. You can't contradict them. And, luckily I have podcasts and radio shows like this where I can come on, but I don't have Fox News or, CNN that I can go on and rebut the lies they tell to a bigger audience.
Well, and as we know with the JFK, with his father's assassination, and I will, we'll also go on record saying with also his assassination and MLK and Bobby Kennedy as well. It's almost as if the media is placed there to stop people from using their analytical mind, using their critical thinking processes, saying this is a little bit too much of a coincidence. This doesn't make sense. And just to put people to sleep again and to say, don't pay no attention. But with JFK, with his father's assassination, I also feel that was quite because they could have killed him any other way. They could have killed him silent, when he was in his hotel room or something, but that was a very public, mass psyops, I believe. And the idea being that if we can take out this person who's the most powerful man in the world, presumably, we can do anything. And I think that's what we all kind of came into. You were 7 years old. That had a huge impact on you and probably millions of other people as well. Some who didn't buy the story, and then others who I think were frightened off from even approaching it because it was so overwhelming to the mass psyche. I don't know if that's something that you relate to as well.
Yeah, well, psychologically speaking, the way he was assassinated, his head blown off in broad daylight, like that on a bright sunny day, right before Thanksgiving. I mean, a lot of this played into the American psyche, and I think that it's cliche to say that that's when America's innocence ended. But I really think it did in many ways, because the idealism that JFK had people that were older than me, the young people that were in the Peace Corps and things like that, that was kind of the height of idealism. When you're ready to run off to the Peace Corps and go help people, that was kind of what JFK was bringing. But when he was killed, and I think no one really looks at the psychological effect that it had going from this elegant movie star looking guy who was a wonderful speaker, and we still listen to his speeches and revel at him, just the way he had the phrasing things with his Boston cadence. And again, the great looks, you can't ever downplay that. That always helps. But to go from that to Lyndon Johnson, who is this big, crude, kind of inarticulate, almost at the level of Trump and George W. Bush. I mean, he was not a great speaker, and he couldn't hide his insincerity. And I think that's the first thing that, watching the coverage at the time, his speech at the airport when JFK's body came back to Andrews Air Force Base, if you look at that speech, it's the most awkward thing. We have suffered a great loss. I have suffered a great personal loss. He sounds so insincere. Exactly. I don't think anyone believed him, and you could just tell. And most people don't know. And actually, my first doubts about the JFK assassination came from before I really even knew much about the minutia of the assassination, other than just kind of knowing Oswald didn't do it. But I read the book called Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, which was a New York Times bestseller. I read it when I was probably 15, 16 years old, because I was already a Kennedy junkie, really, without being into his assassination. I just kind of loved the Kennedy family, and I was just intrigued by it. And it was a memoir written by Kenneth O'Donnell, and Dave Powers, two of his closest aides. And what I got out of that, when they described the assassination, they kind of vaguely expressed doubts. They weren't very open about it, but clearly you could tell they didn't necessarily trust the official version. But they described what happened behind the scenes in Lyndon Johnson's behavior and how much it, how offended they were by it. And how he would just come along and he had the same line to each one of them. I need you now more than he did. He obviously had this political line he used on every one of JFK's allies. And that's where the feud between LBJ and Bobby Kennedy really started, because Bobby Kennedy was so offended by the way he acted, especially when he lied to everyone, because he wanted to take off on Air Force One and he commandeered it. He could have ridden on Air Force Two, which was an identical aircraft. But he demanded to go on Air Force One and demanded to have the oath of office administered before they left Dallas. And he even dragged Jackie out, who was with the blood still on her dress, and made her stand next to him. And Bobby Kennedy was offended by that because he told everyone that he had talked to Bobby, and Bobby said he needed to take the oath of office before he left Dallas. He said, I never said that. Things were never. I mean, I don't think he liked LBJ even before that. But he really began to despise him after that, and that's when the personal feud really intensified. But of course, LBJ was looking over his shoulder all the time, and realized, knew Bobby Kennedy wanted to go to the White House. And of course, in '68, after LBJ kind of curiously decided not to run, we know what happened then. And I've always said about RFK, if JFK hadn't been assassinated, RFK would never have been assassinated.
Right.
They're connected.
No, and anybody who looks into Bobby's assassination, there's so many, just like with John, there's just too many similarities in respect to strange folks. Also, I think it was was it William Pepper, who was the attorney who was representing Sirhan, it was saying that it was all the indications of whatever, a Manchurian candidate or someone who had been placed to be there at that time. And there's all these other characters, the lady in the polka dot dress, and all these other characters that they can't explain. Oh, I don't know.
And these things are when you study politics as long as I have, the connections are everywhere. Even if you just limit it to the assassinations, I mean, I'd go way beyond that. We're talking about 9/11 and Waco and everything. I investigate everything and I question everything. And I think basically we've been lied to about every important event in this country's history. Because we don't have a free press. We have a state-controlled media. The only difference between our media and TASS and Pravda in the Soviet Union is that the citizens were smart enough to realize that this was state-controlled media. A majority of Americans still think when they turn on CNN and Fox News that they're watching free and independent journalists. And to believe that, of course, is laughable. But when you look at these connections, I recently wrote an article, and I write for American Free Press, which is a populist weekly in D.C. here, and I wrote an article about RFK, the assassination, and the reason I wrote it is because I was focusing on Kamala Harris, who's at the moment was a darling candidate of the Democrats.
Yes.
And I knew of her history. I mean, people that study these assassinations know about these things the general public doesn't know. As Attorney General of California, she was disastrous to William Pepper and his legal team trying to get Sirhan a new trial. And I've got her quotes from the article, and it was such a powerful article, I guess, that I heard from a former CNN producer, Brad Johnson, who wrote a book on the RFK assassination, and I also heard from Paul Schrade, who was one of the people who was shot in the Ambassador Hotel. He's 90-some years old now, still going strong, but they both read the article and loved the fact that I exposed the fact that Kamala Harris was, this is what happens. These people, and most of the public don't understand that when you're electing these people, they have a history. And somebody like Kamala Harris has shown that, and I'm not just picking on her because there are lots of other people like her, but when you do something like that and you make the statement she basically made the statement that even if there was evidence of a second gunman, it wouldn't matter as far as Sirhan's guilt. And she had no interest in that. That's like, okay, that wouldn't matter, huh? So that's where we sit with these kind of politicians we have.
Well, you've studied enough the political, and you're there on the East Coast too, very close to the Capitol. That politics, man, it's a crazy
I can smell the swamp every day from
It's
here.
a crazy, and it doesn't matter if they're wearing a red coat or a blue coat or a green coat. It just seems that when you get into politics, when you throw your hat in that ring, that you literally sell your soul for some other a group or goal. I don't pretend to know what the goal is, if it's to control all of us, if it's power, if it's money, if it's I don't really completely understand it. I just know that really good people who have the ability to affect change are somehow crazily just taken out. They either have a plane crash, or they're killed, or suicide with a thing that they can't even, reach.
Right.
It's just it's too much. It's too many coincidences to just think that this is just what happens. Let's go back, because we had mentioned earlier too that this is the 20-year anniversary of the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. Let's talk about what was going on before July 16th, 1999 with him. He had a very popular magazine. I know it was, I think it was George
magazine. Yeah.
George magazine, extremely popular. He, from my understanding, and I could be wrong, I had heard rumors that he was looking into possibly running in New York, running for Senate, right?
Yeah, well, that has been the story that people were saying he was about to enter. Now, people don't realize, even though he had been in the public eye for so long, he was only 39 years old. Actually, 30, was he 30? Not quite 39. I think he was 38 because I think he was born in November, right after JFK was elected. So he was very young still. And he had been pressured into, and I don't think his mother really wanted him to enter politics, but she was gone, and I think he was ready. And again, with the people I talked to behind the scenes, this was something he was keenly interested in. Other things I didn't realize, that he showed up at one of the White House Correspondents' Dinner, for instance, with his special guest was Larry Flynt, who not only was a publisher of Hustler magazine, who had published the naked photos of his mother, and this horrified his Uncle Ted that he would show up with this guy, but I don't think he was interested because of that. Larry Flynt had also notably offered $1 million reward for the real murderers of John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
That's why JFK Jr. was with him, and also he was with Ruth Carter Stapleton, Jimmy Carter's sister, who, unlike Jimmy Carter, who never really talked much about the assassination, Ruth Carter Stapleton was very active in trying to expose the truth about the JFK assassination. Most people don't know that. So at this time, and I emailed and spoke with Wayne Madsen, another investigative journalist, who said he was set to meet with JFK Jr. the week after he had unfortunately died, to talk about being hired by George Magazine as an investigative reporter, and his first assignment was going to be the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, if he was also interested in running, and if he was to be running in New York, who would you say, Donald Jeffries, would he be running against? And who would he be competing against to be New York Senator?
Who with a large body count behind her. Yeah, and that's the thing, I mean, people have accused John Hankey, for instance, who put out a very good video about the assassination of JFK Jr. I think that's what he called it. He tends to blame Bush personally. Other people blame Hillary Clinton personally because, let's face it, she does have a slew. Her and Bill have quite a list of dead bodies behind them. But that's the rumor, that he was going to use the New York Senate as a springboard to the presidency. Now, can we know that for certain? I don't know. But there are lots of indications, and in my book, Hidden History, you had the chapter from that on JFK Jr., and that was really the first time anybody had published a lot of this information in any kind of book that had any kind of circulation. It had online articles and so forth, but I mean, I interviewed people that were in the media that were there at the scene, and talked to some of these people, and I think demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that the official narrative there is completely wrong. JFK Jr. as portrayed was reckless and typical daredevil Kennedy, shouldn't have been flying, wasn't qualified. All that's completely bogus. And one of the things I think is most impressive was Edward Meyer, who wrote the official FAA weather report. He was tasked by the FFA to write the weather report on weather conditions the night that JFK's plane went down. And he was so mad at the press coverage, and I have the quote from the email he sent me years later when I asked him for an update. He's still incensed about it. He said everything the media reported was wrong. That it was not even hazy that night. The weather conditions were pretty good. JFK was not irresponsible, and he was qualified. I quote from one of his flight instructors. So the guy was a good and careful pilot. This is a flight he had made. So, but because of the media, again, because we don't have real journalists in this country. Now, fortunately, I was able to, I emailed one of the good journalists we have, Steve Zbraka, who was covered things live for WCVB TV out of Massachusetts. And I was fortunate to get a researcher, a JFK assassination researcher, Scott Myers, sent me 4 hours of unedited, original live coverage of the search for JFK's plane from WCVB TV. So that's the only reason I know how extensive this stuff was that was later edited out. I mean, there were constant references to a 9:39 p.m. phone call from JFK Jr. Now, that's important because 9:39 p.m. is the exact moment we're told, according to the official story, that his plane took a death spiral into the water. And at that 9:39 p.m. phone call, which UPI reported, ABC News reported, and I quote from the dispatches in there, and this local news coverage mentioned it over and over again, the 9:39 p.m. phone call in which JFK Jr. said everything was fine, sounded very calm, and was awaiting landing instructions. And the Coast Guard even sent a petty officer, Todd Bergen, to do an interview with a reporter on, and I have the interview on the tape, WCVB TV. Susan Warnick is the reporter that did that interview, and later I tried to email her, and I emailed her 3 or 4 times. She never replied. And because I said, what do you think about this guy giving an interview? And the interview was about the 9:39 p.m. phone call. Now later, of course, when the military took over, within a day or two, they claimed that there was no communication. So that 9:39 p.m. phone call went down the memory hole. So the Coast Guard, I wanted to ask that reporter, what did you think of the Coast Guard sending out someone to talk about a conversation that never happened? Does that sound feasible to anyone? But these are the kind of lies that were sold, and the Susan Warnicks of the world, and I'm not picking on her, but she obviously doesn't have the courage of her convictions. And I've had to communicate with other reporters about other subjects that are gutless. They don't question these things. There are no Lois Lanes in these newsrooms. They're not inquisitive about anything. And even when they're personally involved, that was me or you. I would hope if you talk to someone and then the government tried to tell you the subject of your interview, what you talked to them about, never happened, I would be really, really curious, upset, and I would hope my superiors would back me. But that's not the way our state-controlled media works.
Well, and then there's also that fear aspect where, the Lois Lanes and the Clark Kents seem to kind of dissolve because there's that implication. Like, again, if they can do this, because they know,
Sure.
They know. Now, there's also you write about in the chapter on the death of John F. Kennedy Jr. That John, his plane had a black box, correct?
Yes.
The
battery was missing. Conveniently, the battery had been removed.
It's like the dog ate my homework. Oh, yeah, the battery was removed.
That's pretty much that's their explanation for things in all of these cases. The dog ate my homework, and the American people accept it, and our so-called media accepts it. So that's one thing. If it was just if it was just an anomaly here or there, okay, if that was the only anomaly here, okay, it's just if everything else checks out. But when you have so many questions, the electronic transmitter. There were lots of reports that this was eliciting a signal from a particular spot in the water, and they just kind of ignored it. And they didn't start the search for hours and hours, even though Edward Kennedy himself had to call later on in the morning to try to, you guys going to look for this or what? And it's just, there's so many questions there. You have the reporter that we've still not been able to locate for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, who is Steve Zbraka. That's why he's important. He wasn't working that day. He was off for WCV TV, but when the story came on, I think he was with his child. He just stopped by the beach area, and he didn't have much with him. I think he had a little note and pad, but he didn't have all this. He didn't have a cameraman or anything like that. So he went out and started doing investigative report firsthand on the scene, and he's the one that talked to this mysterious reporter who had all the early reports, UPI, all these news services talked about a local reporter for the Martha's Vineyard Gazette, a very small little paper, who reported seeing an explosion in the sky at 9:39 p.m., the exact same time in the exact same area where JFK's plane supposedly went down. Now, that guy is important because we can't find him. John DiNardo, another early reporter on the internet, because again, the real professional reporters weren't doing their jobs. So people like John DiNardo, John Hankey, John Quinn, these are the people that did great early work and were very helpful to me later in getting the basis for all these doubts. But he tried to contact the newspaper, and they told him the guy had gone back to college. It was impossible to give him their name. He couldn't talk to him. Well, Steve Zabraka talked to this guy, and he told me in an email he would swear in court that the guy existed, and he described him as an older guy with salt and pepper hair. So this clearly wasn't going back to college. And when I contacted the paper, I traded emails with the editor now, and she claimed not to even remember anything about the story, didn't know what I was talking about. And this is a tiny little newspaper, probably serves that community of Martha. This had to be the biggest story
in the history of their entire career.
And she said she was there at the time. So what can you do? And when I kind of questioned her again, she stopped replying to me. But that's what happens when you investigate these stories. And eventually you become like me, where you're so cynical about it all because there's a pattern. There's a pattern over and over. It's not an anomaly. Okay, you get one bad reporter, you get one, whatever. They're all the same, and it's very frustrating, and it leads you to the point where I am, where I don't trust anyone, and I don't trust anyone or anything that comes out of the mainstream media.
No, and as we've learned with the calls for war, after 9/11,
Yes.
going after Saddam Hussein, who had nothing to do with 9/11,
right.
the mushroom cloud, that,
right.
And which the media just went full throttle on, and
Sure.
The rush to war, they became more of a cheerleader for that. But the idea that, I think that a lot of people, you're right in saying that the majority of Americans, especially, they think that if they tune into CNN or MSNBC or whatever, ABC or Fox, whatever, that they're getting real news. And it may have a bias, it might have an angle, but that they're at least getting the news, they're getting information. But that's why also I'm happy to say that there's a growing number of people that the veil has been lifted, so to speak. They know that there's no way all these things could happen, and they're questioning. And that is why the explosion of podcast, people can actually search out information instead of just turn the television on and being fed these lies. They're seeking out programs like this and other programs that you've been on, seeking out that information in large numbers. So I'm very hopeful on that front, that there is a large movement of people that are waking up.
Well, I am too. Certainly when we saw it, I think the first one of the incidents I've ever seen where there was widespread doubt, to put it mildly, even among the mainstream media, now they may have been playing a game, was with the recent death or whatever happened to Jeffrey Epstein. But when that happened, I don't think there's a person in America that believed that he killed himself. But you have people on the left, blaming Trump. You have people on the right blaming Clinton because he had connections everywhere. But I thought it was a little encouraging that there at least was a skepticism about it. But we've already seen that the authorities have already come out and said he killed. You've seen the cell and saw there was nothing there to hang himself. Well, it's ridiculous. Where's the security footage? He was beat up before by the guy, the ex-cop murderer who was his roommate, but then they claimed, no, he actually attempted suicide. It's like, the story, and this is what happens in all these cases, the narrative changes. And people, there's no reporters there to say, wait a minute, you just said this, you said that. Yeah. They don't catch the contradictions. And so they're allowed to just change these stories wildly changed him. I mean, you go back to something like the death of Vince Foster that I've written about, where most people don't know. The story goes that he was found on the ground in Fort Marcy Park in outside of Washington, D.C. There's a Secret Service memo that describes right after he was found, describes his body being found in his car. Now that changes everything about the crime scene. There's no reporter outside of someone like me or writers like me that even question that. Talk to the Secret Service people that wrote that memo. If they're that incompetent to mistake the ground of a park
right
for a car, then and that's, you see that stuff all the time. And so this is why things like this, the narrative becomes important. He tried to kill himself. He was on suicide watch, and then when people started questioning that, well, no, actually, he'd been taken off suicide watch. Like, where's the security footage? Where's the camera footage?
The most highly watched and talked about person of the day.
Yes.
And the security cameras just happened to not be working, just like on 9/11 with the security. Oh, it just didn't.
They don't work anywhere. I mean, I talked to Scott Forbes, who worked in the Twin Towers. He wasn't there on that day, September 11th, because he had just happened to be off that day, fortunately for him. But he talked about, he tried to go to the Port Authority, he tried to go to the NYPD, and then he tried to go to the 9/11 Commission, because he and his surviving people could testify, they had been there for a very long time, that there were all these bizarre power outages and strange things happening in their area of the building right in the time leading up to the 9/11. He thought that might be significant. Not only did they not want to hear from him, the 9/11 Commission just outright said rumors about there being power outages and so forth have proven to be unfounded. Now, this is a guy who was this on time. You talk to the people that were there. Imagine how they feel when the government investigation says, well, no, they were mistaken. They experienced it firsthand. Pay no attention to what to your lying eyes. Listen to me. And so that's why all these things are so important. That's why that story on Fox News from JFK Jr.'s pal, talking about, and this is something I know personally from talking to people, that this is a subject, he apparently the only Kennedy member really that was, until now with Bobby Jr. has come out and started getting much bolder now recently and talked about the assassinations. But Caroline certainly doesn't, and no other Kennedy ever has. So behind the scenes, JFK Jr. had a quest to find out. This was a subject that not only, his buddy from the History Channel notwithstanding, not only did he mind it being talked about, but apparently it was maybe his most favorite topic of conversation behind the scenes. So when you hear that and you know these things, and to hear the lies perpetuated by this state-run media we have, it's very frustrating, because we have to break through that and have free media. And we have it on the internet, on shows like this. But unfortunately, with the censorship that's coming to play on YouTube and social media, they've already deplatformed mainly right-wing people. But as I said at the time with Alex Jones, this guy was a big name in the so-called world of conspiracy, regardless what you think of him. If they can take him down, and they took him down, there are lots of smaller people they can take down just as well. And, you have to stand up as a civil libertarian. I got that from Mark Lane. I defend everyone's right to say what, even though if I disagree with it, and I will always do that. But there are no civil libertarians left. Everybody wants to lock up people and get them fired for things that they say that offend them. And that's not freedom of speech. And that's why we don't have any free press, because it's all been politicized.
Well, and that's the power, again, of programs like this, and especially when people listen to it and it's resonating with them. And if it's either they're getting goosebumps or they're like, yep, I know it. Every single thing that you're saying, I agree with. And I'm so happy that somebody is actually speaking it. The importance of people to share that as much as they can, and while it's available, because probably wherever this is shown or put up, there'll be, what are they, those fact checker things, JFK Jr. it was a plane accident, damn it.
That's right. The resident historian of the History Channel tells you, come on, who are you going to believe? I mean, the people that knew him, or the resident historian of the History Channel? I mean, it's laughable. And that's, it's unfortunate, because, even YouTube, a big thing like that, used to be a really freewheeling place. And whenever any of these things happen, like say the death of Epstein, or even the shootings in El Paso and Ohio, which have already been forgotten largely, they get forgotten so quickly and they move on to the next one. And the inconsistencies get lost in the shuffle. And you always used to be able to go to YouTube, a big platform, and you could find tons of videos produced a lot of times by people in their parents' basements, but they were doing real investigative work. I mean, some of them were kooky, but some of them were really good investigative journalism. And they asked the questions, you know, whether it's Sandy Hook, Boston bombing, any of these things that no one else was asking. And I miss that, because I tried to check after those shootings, and there was almost nothing there, because they've really clamped down on it, and they instantly direct all searches to your horrible mainstream news. You know,
Right.
You know that you're not going to get any questioning there whatsoever.
Right. Going to directly to CNN, and it has been the citizen journalists too that have been on the ground, maybe in not in particular in 1999 in Martha's Vineyard, that, you know, in that area, the local media you can't necessarily rely on, but there are citizens that will take it upon themselves and go, this just doesn't make sense, and they'll do their own research and digging. And we do need to foster the importance of keeping that alive for people. If not, then we will be just one channel, one state run, you know, access point of information, and really then your true democracy is done at that point.
And you know, and so of course, and well, long before the internet, you know, back and long before I was active politically, when the first books started appearing that were critical of the Warren Commission, it wasn't there were none by any professional journalists. The professional journalists of the day, the Scotty Restons and Tom Wickers of the New York Times and so forth, and Walter Cronkites and Dan Rathers, who got to start lying about that as a local reporter in Dallas. You know, talked about the president's head going forward after he watches the Zapruder film and things like that. That's how he got his start. None of them did any investigative reporting. They backed the Warren Commission to the hilt. It was left to people like Mark Lane, who was a civil libertarian and a New York assemblyman at one time, and a lawyer who rushed to judgment. He had to go to Great Britain. He couldn't get it published in the United States at first. He had to go to England to get it published. You had people like Sylvia Marr, who was just a worker for the World Health Organization. And she wrote Accessories After the Fact, which is still probably the best compendium of information, still holds up well from the mid-'60s. And she also, most people don't realize that this was done so purposefully and so heavy-handed. The Warren Report was an 888-page set of conclusions. It was basically a prosecutorial brief against Oswald, a huge biography of Oswald, largely fanciful, full of crazy stuff like, Jack Ruby's mother's dental charts. Like Mark Lane pointed out early on, that wouldn't have been significant even if Jack Ruby had bitten Oswald to death.
Right.
That kind of thing. Oswald's pubic hairs, things like pictures of that, crazy stuff that had nothing to do with it. They padded the record with 26 volumes of hearings and exhibits. Now, nobody cared about most of the exhibits because they were largely meaningless as the ones I described, but the testimony was important. Even though they failed to call a lot of the most important witnesses, and they called laughable witnesses that, like, for instance, they spent like 20-some pages talking to a woman who had known someone who had babysat the infant Lee Harvey Oswald. She was called as a witness to these, but they couldn't call Admiral George Berkeley, the president's private physician, who was a recipient of all the medical evidence, was in the motorcade, was at Parkland Hospital, at Bethesda, everywhere. He should have been one of the first witnesses. They didn't call a lot of the close witnesses to the assassination. They didn't do anything they were supposed to do, and no journalist called them on it. And those 26 volumes weren't read by journalists. They read the set of conclusions. And it was left to people like Sylvia Marr, Harold Weisberg, who was a former OSS officer who had retired and become a chicken farmer. Another one of my heroes. And he couldn't get any of his work published either. He had to self-publish. His wife, I met him in the early 80s, and he was very old, very cranky guy, but really a brilliant man. He spent the last 20 years of his life going, and that's how I met him. I picked him up in D.C. and drove him back to his farm in Maryland just because I wanted to meet him. And he couldn't drive, and he would go to D.C. every day, take the bus or a cab or something to file Freedom of Information Act lawsuits against the government that didn't want to release them. I mean, that was a real profile and courage. People like that, these were the people that Shirley Martin, who was a housewife in Dallas, who did a lot of the investigation to begin with that real reporters wouldn't do. And of course, they were smeared. There was a book written by Lawrence Schiller, who's still active. He got involved with the John Bonet case and so forth. He's just been a sensationalist tabloid guy forever. He co-wrote a book with a New York Times reporter, of course, called The Scavengers and Critics of the Warren Report, where they took all these people to task and they made fun of them. I think that, Sylvia Meagher was apparently a practicing witch, so that discredited her to them. It didn't matter what her
you have
research.
to have the hit team.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what they did.
Yeah.
It was Penn Jones Jr., who was a little newspaper editor in a very small newspaper, and who was the first one to tabulate all the mysterious deaths in the JFK assassination. He was smeared as, as a drunk and so forth. And, this is what you get because, so we had to depend on people like that. Without that, you wouldn't have had the 80-some% or whatever in most polls, at least for a long time, of the American people that believe there was a conspiracy and don't think Oswald did it. If they just listen to the mainstream media, be 100% that believed it. So that's why it's so important that they did the work of the internet. If the internet had been back then, there would probably been even more information. But now we have the internet, and so things like the JFK Jr. assassination, until my book came along, Hidden History, where I had a chapter devoted to it, and I've had a lot of people saying you should write a whole book about it. Well, I don't know, maybe, who knows, someday. But that hadn't appeared in at least this side of the story that really examines the evidence critically and how flawed the official story is. That hadn't appeared anywhere except on the internet. And that's sad that even in that time, the publishing industry, and this is someone who's been published. I'm fortunate enough to have a publisher, or two publishers now. But it's harder, and there are fewer people that read books too. It's harder to get, like, if the people were writing about the JFK assassination today, they probably would not be able to get the kind of publishers that some of them had. Some of them had small publishers or self-publishers, but they would probably have to go to the internet as well. So we need to keep the internet free.
We need to keep it free. We need to keep it vibrant, and we need to also encourage young people to have those critical thinking faculties as well, and not just sip the Kool-Aid, so to speak. You had mentioned your book Hidden History, and the chapter on JF Kennedy Jr. is chapter 7. But and we have just a few minutes left in the show, but I wanted to give people an idea of a few of the other stories that you cover in Hidden History, so that they can go out and get your book, so they can support you and support an independent journalist and the work that you do. So what are some other areas that you cover in Hidden History?
Well, Hidden History is basically a timeline of my life of being, not that I was politically aware at the time of the Kennedy assassination, but it starts with the JFK assassination. It's basically the 50 years after that. Donald Trump's name, I don't think, even appears in the books. That shows how much it's changed in a few years, that he hadn't arrived on the scene yet. Now you can't talk about anything without mentioning him, but it goes up through the Obama administration. And I talk a lot. I have a big section on, obviously, the JFK assassination gets the most play. And I talk about the connections between the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, MLK. I talk about the fake radicals on both sides and how our intelligence agencies infiltrated groups like the Black Panthers and the KKK, and how involved they were in people like Timothy Leary and Gloria Steinem both being connected to the CIA, things like that. And all the way through, I don't spend that much time on Watergate, because I think Watergate was kind of boring compared to most of these things.
Right.
Actually, and I talk about the House Select Committee on Assassinations and their failure to their job. And I go up through, big Oklahoma City bombing. I have a lot on that, a lot on Waco, a lot on Ruby Ridge, which is getting some play now because it's the anniversary of Ruby Ridge, especially on 9/11, and all the way through the Obama scandals. And I talk about the body counts that Clinton body count. I go into that in depth. Both Bush body counts, Reagan had a body count, Obama had a body count. And so these kind of things, I mean, if you're left or right, I've had people as far left as Cindy Sheehan, the international peace activist, is a fan.
I know
she wrote
Cindy,
a blurb.
yeah.
Yeah, she wrote a blurb. Cynthia McKinney, who I've become close to. She's one, and her and I are like on a par. I mean, she's my favorite politician. She loves my work.
Very brave. She's a very brave lady.
On the right, Roger Stone loved it and wrote the foreword to the paperback version. Jerome Corsi loved it. So Lou Rockwell loved it. And now my new book that I have is basically a prequel to this. Because I wanted to call it Hidden History 2, the prequel, but the publisher wanted to go with Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776, 1963, the history they didn't teach you in school, and that basically covers a lot on Lincoln, a lot on the Lincoln assassination.
Oh, really?
Yes, a lot on Allied war crimes that were covered up, a lot on the senselessness of World War I, a lot about General
Pearl Harbor.
Yes, Pearl Harbor, the false flag of Pearl Harbor, going back
Vietnam.
Oh yeah, well, these false flags go back to 1898. Remember the Maine, and
Yes, right.
1917, the sink of the Lusitania, that got us into World War One, and of course Pearl Harbor, and of course goes all the way through the Gulf of Tonkin and the weapons of mass destruction. I mean, we're still being sold these things, and the American people, unfortunately, continue to fall for them. But I think that it's important to read these books, because you read even the new one, which is about older history, you realize how we reached the position we're in, because there's so many disastrous things that happened. And as you mentioned earlier about history, that's the kind of the subtext of this book. We must always remember history is written by the victors. Well, unfortunately, the wrong people in our country have won pretty much for a very long time, and they're writing the history. And I call them the court historians, and they're the ones that defend these really nonsensical narratives and distort the truth, and they make villains into heroes many times, and they make genuine heroes into villains also. And it's sad to read it, because if you don't know your history, as Santayana said, you're condemned to repeat it. And
Yes.
Unfortunately, when the victors write the history, you're going to get their version of things. And that's what we have. These court historians serve the same purpose that the mainstream journalists do today in terms of current events. They just rewrite history, and we're almost at the point where we're like Winston Smith was in 1984, where he worked for the minutes, where he just, okay, well, they've always been our enemy, they've always been our friend, and just start throwing things down the memory hole. And that's where we're at.
It's that and Stockholm syndrome, where we start to just go, okay, it's another. But when people realize, and in particular about like with the Vietnam War and the Gulf of Tonkin, it was 40 years later, and I think it was McNamara publicly, like on camera, said, look, we made a mistake. It didn't happen.
Right.
So you're telling me hundreds of thousands of American men and women and their families completely devastated, killed, disabled for the rest of their lives, post-traumatic syndrome because the shit that they had to do and we were exposed to. So all of that did not have to happen, because you guys just made a mistake, which is baloney. Yeah. You knew exactly what you were doing. And then 4 million Vietnamese that had to die, all of the devastation with Agent Orange and all of that, death. These are real lives, and that's why these shows are important, is because, and the books that, like, folks that you write, why I encourage people to get these books is because if you do not know how they're lying to you, the next emergency, urgent war, call to action, draft, it's either going to be putting you and your children in line, and all you got to do is go by a VA cemetery, and you see thousands and thousands and thousands of those crosses, and you realize what a waste of human life, what a waste of energy, all the pain and the sufferings that these, Smedley Butler said it, right? War is a racket.
War is a racket, right?
There's some people that are making a hell of a lot of money and power on these wars, and they don't happen.
I have a lot about Smedley Butler in the book, and he's one of my favorite heroes. And he had a great saying where he said, "War is never about enemies; it's always about opportunities for profit." And he talks about all the fortunes that were made in World War I. And he was also friends with one of my favorite political heroes, still Huey Long. And I hope in another one of my books called Survival of the Richest, which is more about economics and about the disparity of wealth, it's a little bit different. But I have a whole chapter about Huey Long in there, and I get so much feedback on Huey Long in that, because people don't realize how great he was and what a conspiracy his assassination was to stop him, and how this guy, most people don't know, when Huey Long was going to be running for president and they assassinated him because of that, he predicted his assassination on the floor of the Senate. Still in the minutes, he talked about how they were plotting to kill him, and they did. And still, you can go out and read it. And I don't think any of the senators ever done that. But he had the audacity to write a book called My First Days in the White House, which ended up being published posthumously because they killed him. His mythical Secretary of War, because they weren't in Secretary of Defense then, was General Smedley Butler. So there would have been no war under Huey Long, and General Smedley Butler's career ended with Huey Long's assassination. I have the quotes. I was able to form a friendship with Huey Long's great-granddaughter, who's still trying to do his work, and she wasn't even aware of the connection between him and Smedley Butler. I said, look, I've got it right out here. Smedley Butler said, that the greatest honor of my life was being named as his Secretary of War in that book.
Oh,
And
wow.
my whole reason to be in political life ended with Huey Long's assassination. So these are the sad things that happen, and of course, we see it today where voices for peace are always stifled. Someone like Tulsi Gabbard, who is, I'm not completely sold on, but certainly the best of that lot, and she's being frozen out of the Democratic Party debates because even though she wins all the internet debates, looks like Ron Paul did, because she's constantly talking about our ending the war, not to mention auditing the Fed and GMO products and supporting Julian Assange, which none of the others are. And
No, she's too real. She's too
yeah,
real
yes,
and
yes.
she's too honest, and they're not going to let that happen. It's the
Oh,
same when back in the day when Bernie was, again, the majority of people wanted Bernie, but they shoved Hillary,
yes, yeah,
and they stole it,
yes,
But
yes,
again,
it is.
I think with people, here's the thing, like a lot of time when you see what's going on in Hong Kong, when you see what's going on in France, if
Yes.
you start messing with the French and their vacation, they're in the streets.
Yeah.
Thousands of them are in the
What does that
streets.
say about America? Do you know one of the other reasons that the French were donning their yellow jackets? They were incensed that they might raise the retirement age to 62.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be 70 here soon in
Oh,
America.
it's
I
going to
mean,
be
so,
80.
or never, never. You're never getting your money back.
They're going to raise it, and they call it entitlements. And if I hear one
Entitlement,
more
yes.
politician say entitlement for my Social Security, I'm gonna scream. Oh my gosh, Donald Jeffries, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on, and we can talk. I would love to have you back on another time
Anytime. I'd be
because
happy to do it.
I feel like we could just take even just one chapter out of your books and just do a whole show on it. So I would love to have you back.
Sure, absolutely. I'd love to be back.
And why don't you let our listeners know how they can find out more about you and how they can get your books?
Well, I have a blog called Keeping It Unreal. I also had a novel published in 2007 called The Unreal, so I kind of named it after that. I rant and rave there regularly about it. If you can figure out what I am other than a populist, because I'm all over the place. I'm far left most of the time, sometimes I'm far right. But I write about things there, and I get a lot of good feedback from there. So it's donaldjeffries.wordpress.com. Again, my books are out there: Hidden History, Survival of the Richest, the new one, Crimes and Cover-Ups in American Politics, 1776-1963. I have a book on bullying called Bullyocracy that's coming out early next year.
Oh,
So I'm
I
interested.
definitely want to have you. I want to have you back for that. Yeah.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, and we can discuss Survival of the Richest. Just Survival of the Richest. They're supposed to have a paperback coming out at some point soon from with a foreword by Naomi Wolf, who has also become a fan.
I
I
love
love.
her. Yeah.
I'm very grateful that I've been interviewed by her, and we've talked and we communicate. So wonderful. Looking forward to that. And so yeah, we can talk about anything. I'm very easy to find. You Google me. I have lots of interviews out there. You Google Donald Jeffries and author Donald Jeffries, you'll find lots of stuff that hopefully will be of interest.
And also, we'll make sure that with accompanying this podcast show, we'll have links to the blog and also listings of the different books that you've written, so people can.
That'd
Please
be
do,
wonderful.
folks, and not just to support somebody who's doing a really incredibly brave job and is being the historian that we need, but also to educate yourself on what's happening. Again, if not, they'll keep repeating. They're going to keep doing the same stuff over and over again until we all become well educated. And that 100th monkey, right? That thing, that tipping point.
Yeah.
When there's one monkey on the island, the 100th monkey reaches it, and then they go, "Oh, you break the coconut like this," and then it's an innate within us. So.
Yes.
I want to thank you again, Donald Jeffries, and I want to thank you, wonderful listeners, for tuning in this week. Remember, you can share this podcast easily. On YouTube, it's great because you can easily share it on your social media. I encourage that. And until next time, I want to remind you to always think outside of that damn box. Bye for now.
Thank you.